Good morning, everyone. Greetings. Assalamu alaikum. I want to begin by saying how truly delighted I am to be here at Brigham Young University on this gorgeous campus, to be in the middle of these pristine mountains, and to be in the midst of some very good friends and colleagues. I want to especially recognize Professor Grant Underwood and the members of his organizing committee for inviting me to speak at this important event, and who have absolutely gone out of their way to extend warm hospitality to us and to make sure that our visit is as enjoyable an experience as it can be. There is no doubt that Muslims in the contemporary West face enormous challenges in practically every sphere of their lives. The most persistent and predominant of them has to be the challenge posed by the pervasiveness of anti-Islamic sentiments that have gripped many modern Western societies since the 20th century, and that has metastasized in the second decade of the 21st century into what is now known formally as Islamophobia. Although it has earlier roots, the term was made popular by a British think tank called the Runnymede Trust. In a report that it issued in 1997 titled Islamophobia, A Challenge to Us All, Runnymede Trust defined Islamophobia, now quoting from them, referring to dread or hatred of Islam, and therefore to fear or dislike of all or most Muslims. Hamid Dabashi has suggested that such anti-Islamic sentiments represent not so much of a phobia, which is a deeply rooted fear of uncertain or repressed origins, but rather a deliberately and consciously manufactured loathing systematically cultivated by right-wing extremists. It represents, he says, the transmutation of an entire people into a metaphor, categorically hanging on those interchangeable terms, Muslims and terrorists. September 11, 2001 is the watershed mark for the escalation in anti-Islamic sentiment in the global West. For example, in the United States, polls before September 11 typically showed that most Americans confessed ignorance about Islam and were more or less evenly divided between those who harbored positive views about Muslims and those who had negative perceptions about them. In roughly 2000, about 25% of Americans believed that Islam is inherently violent, while 51% disagreed. By 2011, these percentages had dramatically shifted. 40% of Americans were now of the opinion that Islam promotes violence, while 42% disagreed. A report from the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies, published in 2010, established that as many as 4 in 10 Americans, about 43%, confessed to harboring at least a little prejudice towards Muslims. This was more than twice as many Americans who said they were prejudiced in any degree toward Christians, 18%, Jews, 15%, and Buddhists, 14%. Muslim attempts to build mosques, especially in the rural South, have often been greeted with dismay and denounced as attempts to establish terrorist cells in the heartlands of America, as was the case in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, in 2012. Islam is delegitimized as a religion by Islamophobes and presented instead as a political ideology that is not entitled to protection under the First Amendment. The so-called war on terror, which single-mindedly focuses on Islam and represents Muslims as a civilizational threat to the West, continues to foment the spread of Islamophobia. The situation became far worse under the Trump administration between 2016 to 2020. Inflammatory rhetoric circulating on the internet and popular media, and increasingly adopted by government officials and members of the US Congress, led to a spike in violence against American Muslims in the first year of Trump's presidency alone. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, which tracks extremism in the United States, the number of hate groups active in this country rose for the second year in a row in 2016, propelled in part by the mainstreaming of far-right rhetoric by the Trump presidency, particularly on topics like immigration and Islam. The number of anti-Muslim groups grew the most, almost tripling to 101 in 2016 from 34 in 2015. In the first 10 days after Trump's election, the center documented 867 bias incidents, including more than 300 that targeted immigrants and Muslims. Anti-Islamic hate-mongering is also the province of certain think tanks, and I use the term advisedly, such as the Center for Security Policy, the Middle East Forum, and the Investigative Project on Terrorism in the United States. Typically, these organizations traffic in sensationalist rhetoric about Islam and Muslims, attempting to whip up public paranoia about creeping Sharia and about an assumed worldwide Muslim conspiracy to take over the West through the instrument of militant jihad. Rhetoric of this sort has helped to galvanize nativist and xenophobic political opposition to Western Muslims and brought Islamophobic politicians and political parties to power in a number of Western countries. Such rhetoric is not about to go away anytime soon. The American think tanks that I just mentioned are bankrolled by powerful donors like the Donors Capital Fund, the Russell Berry Foundation, the Lynd and Harry Bradley Foundation, among others, and constitute what the Center for American Progress has called the Islamophobia Network. These foundations contribute millions of dollars to Islamophobic organizations. Thanks to their largesse, such organizations have mounted very effective campaigns against Muslims, agitating against their presence and relentlessly vilifying their religion as one that promotes endless violence in the name of jihad. Some of their hate-mongering rhetoric has been adopted by right-wing Christian and Jewish groups and infiltrated the media, not just Fox News and the Washington Times, as might be expected, but also the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal, for example. What were once dismissed as fringe extremist views have seeped into the American mainstream and gained a certain legitimacy, especially after the 2016 presidential elections. Peddling hatred against Muslims has in fact become a powerful and profitable industry in contemporary America. Islamophobia has also gone into overdrive in a broad swath of Europe. In 2018 alone, France saw an increase of 52% of Islamophobic incidents. In Austria, there was a rise of approximately 74%. Polls document that 44% of Germans see a fundamental contradiction between Islam and German culture and values. A whopping 62% of the population in Finland express such sentiments, while in Italy, it is about 53% of the population. Forms of veiling have been banned in a number of European countries, including the hijab ban in French schools and the niqab or face veil bans in Denmark, Belgium, and France that restrict the religious freedom of Muslim women. When Anders Breivik, the Norwegian man who gunned down 77 people in 2011, described his massacre as motivated by the desire to prevent Eurabia, he expressed a common fear that Europe would become colonized by the dreaded Arabs and Muslims. This fear has only grown in certain parts of Europe since Breivik's act of terror. As a recent op-ed in the New York Times stated, to be a Muslim in Europe is to be mistrusted, visible, and vulnerable, and that from the street to the state, Islamophobia is baked into European political life, end of quote. Despite the pervasive talk of Islamic or Islamist terrorism, hard statistics provide irrefutable evidence that a violent extremist minority among Muslims is exactly that, a small minority that represents a sliver of the global Muslim population, now numbering almost 1.5 billion. In his 2011 book, The Missing Martyrs: Why There Are So Few Muslim Terrorists, the sociologist Charles Kurtzman documents that out of the approximately 150,000 people who die daily worldwide, fewer than 50 deaths occur at the hands of Islamist militants, and then mostly in the conflict-ridden areas of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq. However, hard facts do not by themselves readily dissipate impressionistically formed views. Constant and frequently sensationalist media coverage of acts of militancy committed by Muslim individuals contribute further to the hardening of negative stereotypes about Muslims in general. As a consequence, violence and disloyalty to the state are persistently associated with Muslims in the global north. One of the characteristic features of anti-Islamic discourses is the portrayal of Muslims as inherently anti-modern, since they are understood to be biologically programmed to hate democracy and root for theocracy. According to the master narrative prevalent in most parts of the global West, religion and modernity or democracy cannot mix. Secularism is a sine qua non. Ergo, religious people, particularly Muslims, cannot be good citizens. Their adherence to religious norms, especially the much demonized Sharia, renders them irrational and violent. Painted with the broad brush of irrationality, Muslims in toto are rendered as unfit to be proper citizens of modern Western societies. The pedigree of this fetishization of rationality as emblematic of modernity goes back to the late 19th century and the influential writings of the German sociologist Max Weber, who died in 1920, and whose views still hold sway in the contemporary West. Weber conceived of rationalization as a meta-historical achievement that is uniquely Western and that is lacking in other parts of the world, but available for adoption and emulation by others. Rationalization for Weber is a process occurring in different spheres of human life, in music, law, religion, art, etc., with their own internal logic and directions. As a result of this process, he says, irrational customs and traditions, including religious ones, are replaced by conscious, rational decisions based on the individual's self-interest. According to Weber, modern scientific and technological development results from rational self-interest and relentless secularization, which has given the Western world an edge over the rest. The influential anthropologist Talal Asad has written persuasive critiques of the Western project of secularism and its assumed universal and transferable character. He has skillfully dissected various discourses on secularism, in the course of which he lays bare what he regards as some of the disingenuous and parochial claims made on its behalf. For example, one of the persistent myths that has been circulated concerning the secular liberal state is that it is the most effective system to ward off conflict, particularly of the religious and ethno-nationalist type, and to promote a tolerant civil society. Assad disagrees. Secularism, he remonstrates, generates its own rigid orthodoxy and truth claims. Failure to submit to them sometimes elicits violent reprisal and political marginalization. The potentially hegemonic nature of secularism has sought to assert itself as an endemic feature of Western-style modernity, eliciting in its wake pushback from those who do not take kindly to having it imposed upon them. The particular historical encounters of specific people with modernity and secularism understandably color their perspectives on both phenomena and create resistance toward homogenizing narratives that do not match their own experiences and lived realities. This is certainly true of the Islamic world. As John Esposito, who we're very lucky to have in our midst today, has observed, in the context of the modern dynamics of political power, Muslim intellectuals and political activists frequently forge, and I'm now quoting from him, a connection between the secularist doctrine developed in Europe and European colonial expansion in the Muslim world with its legacy of non-democratic, secular regimes in much of the Middle East and North Africa, end of quote. The social and political crucible in which Muslims are engaging the modern world is thus historically specific to them. Within the geographical region commonly referred to as the Islamic world, there is considerable diversity in the ways in which Muslim majority countries are negotiating the challenges of modernity. Without doubt, as ample evidence can be marshaled, religion remains relevant in the various projects of modernization undertaken by Muslims today. This is true even in countries where the post-colonial and modernizing state has attempted to impose secularism on the population in recent history, as in Turkey, Tunisia, and Algeria. As public opinion polls and surveys conducted in a number of Muslim majority societies have repeatedly shown, an overwhelming majority of their inhabitants continue to express positive attitudes toward both Sharia and democracy, for example, and advocate the implementation of both in their own societies, regarding them as mutually reinforcing. In fact, the continuing resurgence of religion in many parts of the world indicates that religion has not only not lost its importance in the public sphere today, but remains an essential ingredient in the crafting of modern individual and communal identities in many societies, particularly in the global South. In more recent times, religious identity has become intensely politicized in the public sphere in contemporary Europe and the United States, especially when such identity is asserted against immigrant Muslims in order to mark them as outsiders. As Olivier Roy noted recently, populist movements and the conservative right, sometimes joined by left-leaning elements, champion Europe's Christian identity in order to counter Islam. In March 2018, the German Interior Minister, Horst Seehofer, for example, loudly proclaimed, "No, Islam is not part of Germany." As Roy observes, in such anti-Islam discourses, Christianity becomes reduced to a shibboleth, so that it has very little to do with worship and spiritual values, and everything to do with setting cultural boundaries against those perceived as undesirable outsiders. Roy goes on to observe astutely that, quoting from him, lurking behind the debate over Islam are much deeper questions about the very nature of Europe and its relationship to religion in general, end of quote. The same weaponization of religious identity has occurred in the United States, born out of similar anxieties about an assumed pristine, homogeneous national culture in danger of being polluted by immigrants in general, but Muslims figuring prominently among them. In both Europe and the United States, religious identity is furthermore strongly wedded to racial identity, so that Muslims, along with other non-white, non-Christian groups, are rendered as doubly the other. The picture is not, however, relentlessly that of doom and gloom. If we shift our glance to particularly the United States, there are also unique opportunities for American Muslims to influence the global narratives that are spun together by so many vested groups that are antagonistic toward their very existence here. Unlike many Muslim communities in Europe, American Muslims tend to be among the most prosperous and highly educated segments of the US population. American Muslims are furthermore not a homogeneous group. Within the American Muslim population, there's a considerable diversity of ethnic groups represented. If one walks into a mosque in a large urban center during a congregational prayer, especially on a Friday afternoon, or during one of the two major annual religious festivals, one will find a veritable United Nations of members from various backgrounds represented: South Asian, Arab, Malay and Indonesian, African, African American, Bosnian, Turkish, Chinese, and others. Despite these considerable cultural variations, the large majority of American Muslims are, on the whole, socially and economically integrated into American society. Unlike Muslim immigrants to many European nations, many of the Muslim immigrants to the US arrived in the 20th century with advanced university degrees from their countries of origin, possessed fluency in English, and evinced a strong desire to adapt to their country of adoption without giving up their religious observances. Of course, we should not forget at the same time that Muslims had arrived as early as the 18th century in the Americas, many of them as enslaved people. About 10% of those enslaved at that time are said to have been Muslim, and most were of North African and West African ancestry in antebellum America. In the United States, American Muslim civil rights and advocacy groups are at the forefront of efforts to push back against Islamophobia and allow Muslims to represent themselves in all their diversity. Among such organizations are the Council on American Islamic Relations, better known as CAIR, the Muslim Public Action Committee, MPAC, the Islamic Society of North America, ISNA, and the Islamic Council of North America, ICNA, which regularly hold conferences, workshops, and information sessions to challenge Islamophobia, provide representation for Muslim citizens in the political and civil spheres, and advocate for the civil and human rights of American Muslims when they are violated in many ways. A number of these organizations provide internships for undergraduate and graduate students so that they may learn critical political and lobbying skills to make them more effective citizens. They, along with local mosques and Muslim communities, also engage in outreach to other religious communities and participate in interfaith activities in order to promote religious and political freedom and combat bigotry. They liaise with members of churches, synagogues, temples, and other houses of worship, and have established broad coalitions with different ethnic and special interest groups, representing, for example, Americans of Japanese, Sikh, and Hindu backgrounds as well, all of whom have similarly encountered cultural ostracism, racism, and violence specifically directed at them in American society. American Muslim groups also work hand in hand with secular civil rights and legal advocacy groups, such as the American Civil Liberties Union, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the American Bar Association, and others, to defend their rights as American citizens. CAIR, in particular, keeps track of incidents of discrimination and violence directed at Muslims and provides much-needed counsel to those seeking legal redress against employers, for example, who discriminate against Muslims. These organizations also call out unfair portrayals of Muslims in the powerful Western media, which often play up violent acts carried out by those with Muslim names and background. An important study carried out at Georgia State University in Atlanta in 2017 found there was a 449% increase in media attention when the perpetrator of a terror attack was Muslim. And this conclusion was based on an analysis of coverage of all terrorist attacks in the US between 2011 and 2015. Muslims committed 12.4% of attacks during the period studied, but received 41.4% of news coverage the survey established. On the basis of these findings, the study concluded that various news outlets were making people disproportionately fearful of Muslims as incipient terrorists. By reaching out to journalists and television reporters and building relationships with them, American Muslim organizations impress upon them that context and the framing of news are important. Conscientious journalists who excel in their jobs should pay attention to both, even when laboring under strict deadlines. Journalists should avoid reductiveness in their reporting and treat Muslims as they would any other religious and/or ethnic group, with a regard for the complexity and depth of their identities and for the multiple interpretations of their religious traditions. Radicalism is, of course, not a problem uniquely confronting Muslims. All religious communities are grappling with some version of it in the context of secular modernity. This recognition has spurred a number of mainstream Christian and Jewish groups in particular to forge alliances with Muslim groups. Such mainstream faith groups are appalled by their right-wing co-religionists who indiscriminately malign Islam and Muslims. They seek instead to build bridges with Muslims on the basis of a shared understanding of the human relation to the divine and commonly held values of compassion, charity, and concern for social justice. Among such notable initiatives is the formation of a group called the Interfaith Alliance, composed of several Christian churches, Muslim organizations, and secular groups, that has recently redoubled its efforts to combat religious bigotry and promote religious freedom for all. Such bridge-building initiatives can be a powerful antidote to the forces of polarization. When the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh was attacked by a white nationalist gunman called Robert Bauer in October 2018, the Islamic Center of Pittsburgh and other concerned American Muslims, led by Tariq al-Masidi, started a fundraising effort called Muslims Unite for Pittsburgh Synagogue. They raised over $150,000 to help the victims of the shooting and their families, and to pay for the funeral expenses of the deceased. Al-Masidi is the founder of a Muslim charitable organization called Celebrate Mercy, and takes as his motto the Quranic verse, repel evil with what is better. This is from chapter 41, verse 34 in the Quran. As a result, Al-Masidi has built an impressive track record of helping people from different faith communities when under attack from hate groups. Good deeds have a way of boomeranging and creating a reservoir of goodwill that can be tapped into in times of tragedy and crisis. A few months after the Pittsburgh shooting, in March 2019, the An-Nur Mosque and Linwood Islamic Center in Christchurch, New Zealand, was attacked by an Australian white nationalist, Brenton Harrison Tarrant, during which 51 people were killed and many others injured. It was the deadliest mass shooting in the history of the country. In the outpouring of support that the Christchurch Muslim community received from around the world, we need to take note of one group that felt a special obligation to help, the Tree of Life members, who started a GoFundMe page with the initial goal of raising $100,000 to help the victims of the mass shooting in Christchurch. They remembered how Muslims had stepped up to help them in their hour of dire need the year before. Such acts of interfaith solidarity often do not receive, actually I should say hardly ever receive, banner headlines in newspapers. However, they do continue to happen below the radar and continue to mount a challenge to the master narratives of sectarian hatred and division in our time. So there is cause for optimism, perhaps modest at this time, that through active engagement and conscious efforts to challenge misinformation and disinformation widespread in the media and internet about Islam and Muslims, one can effect incremental changes in the way both are imagined, constructed, and represented in the global West. Call me Pollyannish, but I prefer to hitch my wagon to this star of hope, confident that only through such concerted efforts, waged by a broad coalition of like-minded people, can we hope to surmount bigotry and hatred and replace them with understanding and solidarity in the hopes of achieving some measure of social justice and parity, however elusive they may seem now. This effort, this struggle, or as many Muslims might be tempted to say, this jihad must continue. Thank you very much.